Well, I read through that handbook for the recently deceased. It says, live people ignore the strange and unusual. I myself am strange and unusual.
Coming to you on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
It's a strange hobby. Curious. Wouldn't it be better if you put her someplace? I've caused you some trouble.
The first Thursday of every month at 8 p.m. GMT and EST and 5 p.m. PST.
Are you mad at me? How mad at me are you?
The female perspective on all things paranormal.
I'll buy a cup if you buy a box of my delicious Girl Scout cookies. Do we have a deal? Are they made from real Girl Scouts?
From the East Coast to the West Coast, across the pond and the world beyond.
Captain Howdy said no.
Captain who?
Captain Howdy.
Who's Captain Howdy?
You know, I make the questions and he does the answers.
Oh, Captain Howdy, yeah, I see.
Nice.
Oh.
Not a psychiatrist, she needs a priest. She's already seen every psychiatrist in the world, and they sent me to you. Now you're going to send me back to them? Help her, just help her.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
It's time for Paradivas.
They're here.
It is Thursday, September 6th, and it's time for Paradivas. Your hostesses of the ghostesses, Marie Samuels and Marianne Donnelly, are with you here tonight. Marianne, how are you doing?
Fantastic. How about you there, Marie?
I am so excited for our guest, I'm jumping out of my seat. So we're not going to waste any time. We're going to go ahead and just get right into the introduction. Tonight we do have an extra special guest with us. He is a published author, researcher, professional psychotherapist with over 30 years investigating the esoteric and paranormal, host of the monthly radio show Radio Hermetica, and station manager of the Paranormal UK Radio Network. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Andy Mercer to the show. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Andy.
That's quite all right. It's good to be here.
I believe it's fate.
Oh, God. Don't blame them. It is quite a funny situation, to be honest, though, isn't it, between you and I, Marie? Just a discovery, a chance conversation, and an unusual discovery as well about where you are.
And as the show plays out, people will see what we're talking about. But how this interview initially came to fruition was I had posted a memory on Facebook from an interview I did back on for my podcast Macabre Moments with Jeff Mudgett, and Jeff Mudgett was explaining his theory on how in part of the interview he was explaining his theory on his belief that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper. And as soon as I clicked post, I was inundated with people passionate one way or the other. Yes, H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper. No, he was not Jack the Ripper. And Andy was one of the people that commented. And Andy is a self-proclaimed ripperologist.
No, that is self-proclaimed. I am, therefore.
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily is it truly a technical title?
Oh, God, no. It's one of those ones that people who are interested in the Ripper have come up with. It sounds quite technical and sounds very sort of professional. We're just a bunch of loonies who are obsessed with a serial killer from 120 years ago. That's really what it comes down to.
Right, so. Right. And so because of the response, just from me posting that memory, I could see that there was many, many people still interested in the case, still interested in, could it be H.H. Holmes? Could it not be H.H. Holmes? We had to do this show. So let's go ahead and start with Jack the Ripper. I'm sure all the listeners are familiar with Jack the Ripper. If you're not familiar with Jack the Ripper, you should probably just tune out now because shame on you.
Wow. let's turn them all away. No. You're absolutely right, though. Pretty much everyone has heard of Jack the Ripper. Even my students who don't know who O.J. Simpson is or Lizzie Borden is, they still know who Jack the Ripper is. So I think you're right about that.
That's pretty scary, actually.
Tell me about it.
It's a funny thing, actually. I'll just tell you a very brief little story. I'm from a town outside of London, but I did live in the middle of the East End for a number of years, right in the heart of where the Ripper murders took place. And I met up with an old friend of mine while I was living there. He had a new girlfriend who was a nurse who was from Ireland, but like a lot of nurses that come over and train in the UK. And she was working in a hospital in London, and I met her up. And he and I were just talking about the fact that I just visited the sites, and she was sitting there fascinated listening to the story about these murders. And she said, "Oh, why have I read about this in the news? This sounds really quite terrible." I said, "It was in 1888." And she sort of looked at me and looked at him and said, "What? You're talking about a murder over 100 years ago, like it was last week?" I said, "Yeah, if you're interested in this stuff, people get very passionate and fascinated by it." And then she was listening to it and wanted to know more about it as well. So it was just the way we were talking about it, like it was happening like last week or something. She was just so taken aback. It was over 100 years ago, but it's one of those cases that just has that sort of passion attached to it, definitely.
Well, and it's such a horrific situation. The crimes that were committed, they were horrific, and it was never solved. And it was done in such a short period of time. It was just kind of like a flash. He came, he slashed, he left, or didn't. We're not sure, but they stopped. So. I think it captures everybody's interest and curiosity, because, how did this guy that was so savage and killed, what was it, 8 women?
Well, in total, it's just 5. I mean, we can happily go through with you the real 5 victims, because people have added others before this 5 and then after this 5, but there was only ever the 5. In fact, there is an argument to be made that it was actually only 4, which I can go into if you're really interested, but certainly what are described as the canonical 5 are the main ones that are considered to be the Ripper's victims.
Let's start with the theory that H.H. Holmes is Jack the Ripper.
If you like, we can go that way around, certainly.
Let's just do that real quick. Let's just get that out of the way, because you being a ripperologist, the answer to this question.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said to you a little while ago, it's more likely to have been Sherlock Holmes than H.H. Holmes, to be perfectly honest with you. It just doesn't add up. I mean, I have interviewed Jeff myself a few years back. I used to be a co-host on another radio show about 4 or 5 years ago, and we spoke to him about it. And it was just when the H.H. Holmes TV thing that he was involved in was just coming on air. And it was fascinating listening to talk about it. And then he got on to the Ripper stuff. And I asked him a few questions at that point, which he really couldn't answer. And was just, well, hey, I'm promoting my show. This is what they want me to talk about. And I thought, well, okay, fair enough. But, I mean, one of the other very good researchers in the Ripper's case is a guy called Mike Cavell, who'd found a lot of far more information than I've ever found. I mean, his collection of documents and books is incredible, but he found basically pretty good evidence to show in terms of locations where it was pretty much impossible for Holmes to have been in London at the time committing the murders. I mean, I can give you a few of them. I did send a list to Marie before, but let me run through a few of these. The murders that are definitely those of the Ripper were at the end of August to the 9th of November. That was the time frame. These are the definite Ripper murders. During those times, that where the Ripper was active. On the 9th of October, 1888, H.H. Holmes was registered as living at an address 701 63rd Street as his home address in a place called Inglewood in the States. He appeared in court in both October and November 1888 for unpaid bills to do with construction work, which of course we know about is his Murder Paris place. Now this is in October and November. In November 1888 it was supposed to be a Ripper murder, the last one, on November the 9th. So unless he's got some kind of jet that can fly him across the Atlantic to attend a court bills to be paid and be in court, and then go and kill someone and then fly back again, it's pretty much impossible. It's listed as having a partner who was pregnant in October, November 1888 and being with that partner at the time, therefore he was still in America. Newspapers have claimed he visited his own family in 1888. So again, he'd need to be flying a jet fighter plane or a TARDIS, perhaps from Doctor Who, to be jetting backwards and forwards across the pond to carry out these murders and fly back again. But I think the bigger thing really is the mode and method of murder. Now, I mentioned before, I am a psychotherapist. I've never dealt with psychopaths that I know of, because psychopaths are good at hiding their real identity. But psychopathic murderers will tend to murder in the same way in each time. They don't tend to have massive or great variations in how they commit their murders. So you have a man who is slitting the throats of women very, very deeply, almost decapitating them on some occasions. He's then basically ripping them open, cutting them open and removing organs, either throwing them around the body or actually taking one or two of them away. That was how Jack the Ripper committed his murders. Most of the mutilations were post-mortem, i.e. after death. It was mutilation and to desex a woman, basically remove the organs. To go from that to them building the murder palace that H.H. Holmes built with his trap floors and strangulations, it's just a totally different kind of murder. No serial killer in history has had that vast a variation in methods and means of killing. It just doesn't happen. It's completely different psychology behind those two kinds of murders. That's the important point. Often ignored when it comes to the Ripper is the whole question of the internal motivations or motives of the Ripper, because at the time of the murders in late 1800s, our knowledge of human psychology was in its infancy. Even good old Sigmund Freud hadn't really got started. So we were just beginning to understand the ideas of what is called a psychopath. Now, this term sort of comes up in the late 1800s, around the same time as Jack the Ripper. So he's seen as the first psychopath because he's the first person that we have that fits the profile that's active at the time. But the term can be applied to many previous murderers who've killed more than one person in the same or similar ways. But this is the thing. We're beginning to understand at that point the idea of human psychology and how that can play its part when carrying out murder. But it wasn't publicly known at the time. It was something that even higher police officers didn't know about, the idea of a psychopath. So they were often looking for real world or ordinary motives for murder. And often some of the suspects that come forward, like Holmes, are put forward because of a more real worldly reason for their killing. But that's the biggest thing with Holmes. It's the fact that historically there are problems in terms of timetable, but also psychology doesn't add up at all. It's a completely different kind of killer. So that's really the thing. In fairness to Jeff, I think it's been more the TV program have pushed him into this kind of box, if you like, of saying it's the two. It seemed that they weren't happy with the idea that the Ripper, that the H.H. Holmes was this nasty, monstrous serial killer of his own kind. They had to somehow add in somebody else who wasn't really involved or related to it to try and bolster up the story, which really wasn't necessary at all, I don't think. But so I gotta
actually disagree with you on the TV pushing him, because I interviewed him 4 years before the TV show even came out. And he was claiming when I interviewed him that he believed that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper because one of the now H.H. Holmes had several aliases that he used, and he found on a registry for a ship that was going over to London from, I believe, Chicago, or somewhere on the coast near Chicago. One of the aliases that H.H. Holmes used quite often, and then a return shortly after the last Ripper murder with the same alias. And so Jeff believes that it was H.H. Holmes using one of his common aliases. But the problem with that is, I mean, that could actually be a whole another independent person, and that's his real name.
Absolutely, that's the biggest problem with that whole idea. It could well be that he's the person's name. It happens to be the same as one of the aliases. But again, that's speculative at best. I mean, I was being generous to Jeff there. I thought he was being more railroaded by the show, but then perhaps maybe he's not. So I think it's interesting. But I mean, they say the problem also is the time frame, the timeline of the murders. It just seems he can't be going backwards and forwards across the Atlantic that fast. You know, not in those days. It was impossible. It takes weeks to. So that really was a problem for him.
You have court documents. He was in court in the United States during the time of the Ripper murders.
Exactly. That's the problem. I mean, I must admit, it's all credit to Mike Cavell. He's the one that's found this information, because he researches anybody and everybody who gets linked to the Ripper, and he found this information. He said, I spoke to him about it. It's in books. It's in books on H.H. Holmes. It's not sort of secretly hidden away files. You can find the information. You can do the research and find it all yourself. It is there. These documents are listed with his name and those dates that show he was clearly in the States at the time, whereas addresses I mentioned before and appearing in court, like I said as well. So that really just blows the whole thing out of the water. But I say, it could be that there was a person with that name, it's his actual name, sailing across the Thames, the Atlantic.
Yeah, well, remember, too, just because you have a court date doesn't mean you actually were in attendance either, because his lawyers could very well have been filing those motions and things like that for him on his behalf as well. Not necessarily that he's physically in the courthouse on those specific dates. Just want to throw that out there. Just for that additional,
But as I say, registration at a particular address, it may well have had other representations there for him. But I would imagine there'd be at least an attempt to find the guy if he's got to be in court, and just to check of his location. I would imagine his lawyer would have to report exactly where the guy was, even if he wasn't attendance in the court himself. But no, it just doesn't stack up. More importantly, as I say, the psychology is the key issue here. You do not have in history serial killers who change their MO that dramatically in that short period of time. It's just, in any period of time, it doesn't happen. A serial killer finds a means, a method of killing, and they will refine it. They will make it worse. They don't change it. It stays pretty much the same. And that's the biggest thing, which means it's just impossible. And to be perfectly honest with you, there are far better candidates for the Ripper's identity, far more evidence towards these people being involved, far better descriptions of identity. That the information is there. It is not that hard to find a very, very, very good suspect. That he's often mentioned in name. There are certain little errors and issues around the names, but there are a number, I give you 3 or 4, who are far, far more likely to have been the Ripper than H.H. Holmes, absolutely. I mean, I'll be honest with you, there are no serious ripperologist, if you like to use that term, no serious researcher takes H.H. Holmes seriously at all. It's just seen as one of those rather silly, quirky stories that gets out and about, like the idea of the Prince of Wales being the serial killer, the Queen's Doctor being the serial killer, the Masonic conspiracy as being the idea of more than one murder. It was all conspiracy. I mean, the theories are just nonsense. They just do not stack up at all. But yet they're still out there. Still people write books about them, but they're complete nonsense. They don't add up.
So would you mind taking us through the timeline then of the 5 victims that Absolutely. Are known to be, victims of the Ripper?
I will certainly do that, no problem at all. Well, it all began with the first killing on August the 31st, 1888, which was a bank holiday here in the UK, been quite a warm, sunny day apparently. A body was found on a road called Bucks Row. It was found lying beside the entrance to a gateway, which was to a small stables at the back. The guy who first found the body initially thought that she was either drunk or was asleep, and he approached and looked at the body to check her over. And his name was Charles Cross. I'm just checking my notes here to remind myself. His name was Charles Cross. He found a line there, thought she was asleep or drunk, and moved a little bit closer. And another man joined him, Robert Paul, and they weren't sure if she was drunk or dead, but decided to go and find a police officer. So they went off in one direction. In the opposite direction, another police officer on his beat came along and found her and was quite sure she was dead. He could see her throat had been cut, but as far as he was concerned, there was nothing else. And when the first 2 men who found the body originally came back with another police officer, they all agreed that she was probably murdered, possibly for money or for whatever reason, but definitely where she lay. There was blood there. There's no reason to think if she was murdered anywhere else other than where she was found. They call for what's called a gurney, which is basically an old trolley, wooden barrel, basically, to take her body away to a local morgue to be checked over, to be basically examined and see what's happened. It was only when they got her there the following morning that they discovered she had been mutilated. Definitely been cut from left to right, very deeply across her throat, which was definitely the cause of death. But then her clothes and skirt had been lifted up, and a single large gash running basically from her abdomen up to her breastbone, cutting quite deep and exposing the organs inside. There was nothing else done, just this one very severe cut. Now, unfortunately, the 1880s in East London was a bit of a rough area, a bit like the Wild West, if you like, back in those days, but not so many guns involved, more sort of knives. And unfortunately, robberies and violence with knives was quite a common thing. And actually, murder wasn't that unusual as well, because particularly prostitutes who were, obviously, as a prostitute, out all night and nowhere to live, and often could get sort of mugged or robbed of their takings, and sometimes the violence went a little bit too far. So for someone to have their throat cut wasn't that unusual, but the mutilation was unusual. That was quite an unusual thing to find. There was someone that had done something like that. It was already thought that it was almost certainly post-mortem after she was murdered, because the fact there was less blood coming from those wounds than there was from the throat, because obviously the throat's cut first, blood bleeds out. Sorry if it gets too graphic, guys, by the way, do say, but I think it's important to get the details. And the body was then basically cut open and was left by whoever the killer was. But there was no doubt about it. The person was murdered there in the early hours of the morning and was left, and was that was really it. That was all there was to it. There was not a what's the word? Autopsy was carried out. There was a coroner's meet, and basically they agreed it was a murder and that they should be investigated. But in those days, investigating things in like murder were pretty difficult. You had to really catch a suspect at the act, or get a confession from somebody, or have a very good eyewitness, and no one came forward. No one saw or heard anything, even though people were living fairly close by. No one saw anything. So that was kind of it. That was an unusual but quite nasty murder, and that was probably the end of the story. Until
now, the first victim, she wasn't missing any of her internal organs. She just had the cut.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, there was nothing missing. It was just this rather nasty, quite deep incision that cut right through down into the intestines, but they were protruding out of the wound. They weren't actually taken from the wound or removed. Everything was in place as it should be, just slashed through by this cut. It was certainly one large cut with a long, narrow-bladed knife of some kind or other. I mean, they couldn't say specifically what, but they could tell the kind of knife that was being used. And that was pretty much it for that first murder. So, any questions, Mavke?
Nope, that was my only one.
Okay, fair enough. Well, as I say, 8 days later is the second murder. A woman by the name of Annie Chapman, again a prostitute, is found at the back of 29 Hanbury Street in a small courtyard behind the house. Now, these are small, what are called tenement buildings, which are small, narrow buildings, all in single blocks, and they often have little archways between them that lead to like a shared courtyard that would be shared by 2 or 3 of the houses. And these houses didn't have toilets or anything like that inside, so these facilities would be outside of the small shed at the back. She was found by a guy called John Richardson about 4 o'clock in the morning, having so about 5:30 in the morning rather. He'd come down to basically feed his pet rabbit, which was kept in the back, and he found this woman's body lying there. She was face up, lying beside a fence. There was a splash of blood against the fence, and her head was pointing towards the archway, and her feet towards the back of the courtyard. Initially, he just looked and thought, "Oh, that's not very nice. And what the hell's that?" She had been again cut open, but this time much more ferociously. And some of her organs had been removed and dumped across her shoulders. The intestine was over her shoulders, and other parts of her internal organs were basically spread on the floor. Everything was believed to be there. Nothing was thought to be missing at this point, but certainly it looked like there's been more of a savage attack had taken place. Now, interestingly, there were potentially witnesses to this, the most important of which was a guy called Albert Kadosh, who lived in the house next door. He came out to his backyard to use the facilities at about 4 o'clock, at which point he heard movement in the courtyard next door, a woman's voice saying no, and then a thump against the fence. Now, it's quite possible that had he looked over the fence, he would have seen Jack the Ripper, the murderer, actually committing the murder at that point, but he didn't. He just thought it was just an argument or a domestic and didn't want to get involved in that. But they certainly found what's called arterial blood splashes, which is from the arterial vein in the neck, were across the fence. So it's clear he'd been, again, cut left to right, one slash, very deep, almost severing the spinal cord, and the blood had splashed against the fence as she'd fallen. So very possibly he was right next door. There were other items that were found nearby that have sometimes been described as being piled up, rings that were taken off the woman's fingers, a number of coins. All sorts of strange stories have been made up about these things being made into specific sort of... They weren't. They were just dumped on the floor beside her. Whether they'd fallen out of her pocket as she'd fallen, or the Ripper had tried to rob her but didn't bother, don't know. But these coins and rings belonged to her. They were little brass rings that were taken from her hand. There was also a piece of an envelope that had a regiment's name on it, Sussex Regiment, Army Regiment, who was thought to have belonged to a friend of Andy Chapman, who was a supposedly retired soldier, but when they checked, the guy was actually telling porcupines. He wasn't a soldier at all, and the regiment had nothing to do with him or her. It looks like it was just a piece of paper she'd found which contained some pills that she was supposed to be taking. And that was it. Again, it was pretty nasty, pretty violent, and the body was again taken away and confirmed these very nasty murder had happened. But this had got people stirred up now, because this was the second one that had happened within, let's say, just over a week, and this time the mutilation was much more violent. The press was interested, and part of the problem with the whole Ripper story is the press kind of goes a bit mad over this. It's a much bigger story in the sense that it was a way of having a go at the local police forces. The newspapers of the area in particular were very scathing of policing, saying it was either too heavy-handed or not enough of it. And so the fact that there was unsolved violent murders taking place was an opportunity to basically for the press to have a go at the police and having a go at authorities, saying they were incompetent, etc. So the murders were getting blown out of all proportion quite quickly, very deliberately by the local press, being very sensationalist. Dare I use the words fake news was playing its part in all this, because lots of strange stories and conspiracies already started to appear in the press. Claims of strange people being seen around in the area, but again, there was no actual witnesses who claimed any of these things. The woman, Annie Chapman, was seen with a man not long before she was found murdered at the front of Hanbury Street in the street, where she was apparently talking to somebody, and the witness said that she heard the man say to her, "Will you?" And she said yes. And the witness, whose name I must have forgotten, said that the man had something of an accent. Now, what he was probably referring to was more like an East European accent, or potentially a Jewish accent, because this is the thing. There is indications at this early point even that there was a Jewish connection, but not some kind of mad conspiracy again, but more that the murderer himself may well be Jewish. So that was really it for that murder. That was, as I say, that was September the 8th. And it was, say, quite a nasty one. Again, this mutilation was going on, and body parts were being scattered around, but then nothing was thought to be missing. So there is a report later on of a newspaper received, actually I must admit that more clearly, by this point the sorts of things were forming called vigilance committees, where people were actually going out and trying to sort of find the murderer and protect the local women. And the guy who was heading one of the vigilance committees received a letter in the post which contained a small box, and the letter itself started off with the headline of "From Hell," and described basically the fact that the murderer had killed one woman and taken a piece of the organ away, and that he'd fried it and ate it. Now, there's some confusion as to which murder this letter was particularly referring to. The From Hell letter itself has become quite famous, but there's some problems with timing as to whether it was the second or the third victim's organ that was supposed to be, it's a piece of kidney basically, that was recovered and kept and supposedly cooked and eaten by the murderer. But I mean, we can get onto a bit more later. The fact is, there is no way on earth that any of the letters that were written to the police were real. They were all undoubtedly fake. They were either written by the newspaper people trying to keep the story moving forward, or sensationalists, or just fantasists. The police and the press received hundreds and hundreds of letters. A few of them have survived, particularly the ones that use the name Jack the Ripper, because that's where the name comes from one of the letters that was sent to the police, where the name Jack the Ripper appears, and it kind of stuck, because it was up to that point just known as the Whitechapel Murderer. So you've got these murders taking place. The possibility of organs may or may not have been removed, and some confusion as to who and when these organ pieces may or may not have been removed. You see, it's far less clear-cut than often a lot of modern writers will present this case as, because the records themselves get a little bit confused, unfortunately. So it's not entirely clear as to which supposed bit that was taken away belonged to which supposed victim. So, and I'll take a moment and breathe for a second. Any questions before I move on?
Well, so the first two victims, when they did the first victim was missing no organs at all. The second victim, they were removed from her body, but still with the corpse.
Yes, although I'd say there's been some confusion that maybe something had been removed from the second victim, where in actual fact it's more likely to have been the third. It's just I've sort of read some of the books have got that slightly mixed up.
Okay. So let's get on to the third then, because that's the one that did the From Hell letter come before or after the third victim?
You see, I think it came pretty much the same time as the third victim. That's why I think there's a little bit of confusion as to who it actually belonged to. Now, This is where it gets a little strange, and I must admit I'm probably talking 200 miles an hour, which I have a habit of doing, which I'm trying to stop myself from doing, so I do apologise for that. But we get to September the 30th. Now, this has become known as the night of the double murder, where, not surprising from that term, 2 murders took place, both of which have been attributed to Jack the Ripper. But there are certain questions about the first one of the 2 that have been addressed by some, and others have ignored these problems with it. But I am one of the people that's of the opinion that very possibly the first of the 2 double event murders on the 30th of September was not the Ripper at all. The first supposed one is a woman called Elizabeth Stride. Now, she was found in the courtyard of the Workers' Club on Duffield's Yard, which is in now called Henriques Street. And there's a funny story about that, which I'll tell you in a minute. Basically, what happens is about 1 o'clock in the morning, Louis Diemschutz is returning home to the working man's club that he runs with his wife. And it's a Jewish working man's club, and he's going into the backyard, and he sees a woman's body lying down beside the gate just inside the yard. And he actually thinks to himself, it's his wife, and she's drunk, because obviously that must have happened before. He gets off his car, goes into the working man's club, and finds his wife's in there having a conversation with some of the members, so clearly it's not her. So he goes back outside and finds this woman's body lying beside the gateway. Now, it's been speculated that that was a Ripper victim, that he was actually in the process of murdering her when he was disturbed by Louis Diemschutz's cart. There are a few problems here, because there are witnesses that see Liz Stride talking with a man beside the gateway just before Diemschutz returns. But one witness says the man pulled the woman towards the courtyard, and the other one says he pulled her away from the courtyard. Both witnesses say the man looked more classically Jewish, with the side ring knots and etc., that they made him think he was East European Jewish. And one of them shouts at the name Lipsky out quite loudly at this man. Now, Israel Lipsky was a poisoner who'd murdered a woman and her daughter the previous year, so Lipsky become an anti-Semitic abusive term for Jewish people. So it suggests that they at least thought this guy looked Jewish as well. But as I say, there's confusion as to whether he was pulling her towards the yard or away from the yard. But what's also very interesting was, as I mentioned with the first victim, and definitely with the second, they were sure it was a narrow, long, thin blade had been used to cut their throat very heavily, very deeply. This woman, Liz Stride's throat was slit, but very shallow, with what they think was a much broader, rounded-ended blade, a different kind of knife. Now, again, that would be quite unusual for this kind of violent psychopathic murder to change weapon as well, because there are many cases where the weapon that's used becomes almost fetishized by the killer. It becomes a symbolic thing in itself. So to change the knife would seem quite strange. Again, the argument is that Diemschutz disturbed him and he ran off, but Diemschutz didn't see anybody leave the courtyard at that particular point, and no one, as far as I know, saw anyone leave the courtyard at that point. So it's a bit of a mystery, that one. The reason why it's been tied in as an actual Ripper murder is only 45 minutes later in a place called Mitre Square, which is no more than about 500 yards away, so it's pretty close by. Another body is found 45 minutes after this first one, who definitely is a Ripper victim, because she's an absolute mess. This is Kathy Eddowes. She's found in Mitre Square, which is not far from Fenchurch Street Station, so I've been there loads of times, so I used to live in the area. But it's quite close by a busy station, but this is 1 o'clock in the morning, so it's pretty quiet by this point. She's lying in one corner of Mitre Square. Now, again, her throat's been cut left to right, very deep, almost severing the spinal cord. And this time she's been mutilated quite badly. This time the wound is, again, it's from the abdomen up to the breastbone, but also cut across. And she's been slashed around the face and forehead and ears, etc. Have all met this the knife. It's been pretty violent, pretty messy with her. Probably done in no more than 10 minutes or so, because around 1:55, two Jewish men are walking through from a club nearby, and they see a man that kind of darts off away from them. There are different descriptions again. One of the guys says he actually says goodnight to them. One of them says he just sort of walked on past, and they kind of looked at the guy and thought, don't like the look of him, but sort of kept their heads down and kept walking. Now, that's important, and I'll come back to that in a little while about these two guys seeing this man leaving Mitre Square, because within minutes of that, a police officer finds the body, finds the state she's in. But again, as I say, the same kind of neck wound is found. It's deep, it's sharp blade, narrow. So it would appear that for some reason the killer's gone back to the same knife he'd used before. So he switched back. It doesn't make any sense. Why would he have one kind of knife and then 45 minutes later go back to his normal knife?
Right.
That is a bit strange. So that's one of the reasons why I suspect that she might not have been killed by the Ripper at all. But because of this happening 45 minutes later, that they have linked the two together, both being the Ripper. So, as I say, she's a pretty awful state.
The first victim of the the air quote double whammy, right? Did she have the cut from in her
no mutilations whatsoever? Just a cut, just a slit throat, shallow cut, slit throat. I mean, she was dead.
The throat, and that was it.
Exactly, and as I say, the argument has been put forward that it's because Dean Shoots disturbed the Ripper, but as I say, I don't think it was Ripper murder at all. He may well, whoever it was, killed her that way because it was in the press that she had the Ripper victim had their throat cut. But there was no detail of how the throat was cut. As I say, we know from the autopsy reports later on, but they weren't public knowledge, of exactly the depth and the ferocity of the throat slit. I mean, it seems most likely the Ripper would grab them from behind, pull the head up, and then rip across the knife with the throat.
Right.
You know, that kind of action has to be done from behind. You can't sort of stand in front of somebody and cut like that. You know, you just can't get the strength or force behind it. So what probably happens is, and excuse the slightly graphic detail, is that copulation like that in the street tend to be from behind. So you'd pay your prostitute, she'd turn around, bend over, lift up at the skirt, and away you go. So of course he may have paid her, turn around, grabbed her, slit her throat. That's the most likely way it was done. And again, this whole business of having an argument and tussling with this guy at the edge of Duffield Yard's gateway, it again doesn't quite add up, because it seems the killer would strike very rapidly, very quickly, and then do his business and disappear off. To be having a tussle in public where people are seeing it, because there's at least two witnesses, makes it a bit strange. So I'm firmly of the belief that she probably wasn't a Ripper victim at all, that it was actually only the four. Because they're the ones that show the escalation of the violence. Again, from the first to the fourth, the same kind of killing and the same kind of mutilation was happening, but it was getting worse because he was getting either getting more brave or more ferocious. You know, you can argue it both ways, but certainly you're seeing the classic escalation pattern of a serial killer that you would see. You don't then suddenly go off and build murder castles and start killing people in that way and then come back and go back to the other kind of murder. It just doesn't happen. You know, you don't change your mode of... If H.H. Jones was the Ripper, he would have gone to America and killed in the same way as Jack the Ripper was, and he clearly doesn't. That's the big thing, you know. Anyone who continues to murder, even if they go abroad, you're going to get the same kind of murders, but it just doesn't happen. You don't get big windows of months and months. These killings are weeks apart. No killer then would kill within like 3 weeks of each other and then live for 2 years. You know, that kind of drive is just going to get stronger. And that's exactly what we see in the last victim, Mary Jane Kelly, who is... Before
we get to Mary Jane Kelly, though, you had mentioned there was an interesting fact about the two gentlemen that witnessed the second.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that in a while, because that's key evidence towards who I think was the Ripper.
Okay.
I think has the strongest evidence against, but I'll mention those guys again because they play an important part in some of the information that I'm going to get onto a little while, because this is starting to build up a picture here of what sounds like someone who's probably what they call shabby genteel appearance, which was kind of nice language for Jewish appearance in terms of the kind of height, build and look. That kind of sort of classic image. I mean, before I go any further, let me say my wife's Jewish. I have Jewish relatives, so I have nothing against Jewish people whatsoever. In fact, my wife's maiden name is the same as the guy who I think was the Ripper's maiden surname, so that's an interesting thing. I often ribber about that fact. But it's a way to describe. Sorry?
You said you ripper about that fact.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there was
rib, not rip.
Oh, rib her. I thought you said rip her.
No, Becky, especially I say we've just been visiting her brother-in-law over the weekend, and it's obviously he's got the same surname. One of them's talking about doing the show this evening, and he was like, "Oh, really? Is that wasn't it? Yeah, that's probably the guy." So
that's fun.
But when you get to the last one, this is to say, you get this picture building up of somebody from voice, from possible look that suggests he's probably an East European, certainly East European immigrant, because of the accent and the voice that was heard, possibly Jewish. As I say, again, this is descriptions that are being given. So you're building up a picture of the possible identity of the Ripper. The last victim is probably, without doubt, actually the worst. So far, you've had victims who've been in the street. They've been out and about. They've all been prostitutes. They don't work from any particular premises, no brothels or anything like that. They literally live on the streets. You know, they try and raise 4p, which will get them a room for the night in a little sort of doss house. For 1p, you could actually pay for space on a rope where you literally hang your arms over the rope, standing up and sleep that way for a penny. I know it's unbelievable, but you must also think how grotty the streets would have been, that you'd rather sort of pay a penny to sort of sleep hanging on a rope than you would lying on the ground. It gives you an idea of how nasty the East End was in the 1800s. It was an absolute cesspit. And you see, these murders were playing their part in this whole idea of, look what a state the East End of London's in. You know, we have this huge empire, massively wealthy empire, and yet London East End is just an absolute crap hole, really awful. And he was trying to highlight the fact it was that bad, that all these stories about the Ripper was coming out, about the den of iniquity, the sort of the horror stories of the awful life living there. He was really playing it up in the media and the press to try and get at the government and the police. So you've got a lot of this overplay of the story, but I'd say the story itself is getting nastier with Mary Jane Kelly. She was found on the morning of the 9th of November 1888. Now, she actually did work from a small room, which she was briefly sharing with another prostitute who'd moved out only a couple of weeks before. And basically what happens is the landlord, who owns the property obviously, was basically coming for the rent. She was 6 weeks behind, and he basically wanted the money. She had a small window in literally like one small room, and the window had a jacket stuffed into a crack in the window, which had occurred, and you could actually reach in through the crack in the window to unlock the door. So he'd basically pushed through the piece of material to look into the window to see if she was in there, and what he saw was horrendous. Basically, again, the medical examination showed that she had died from the deep cut slit throat, again, cut right back to the vertebrae, to the spinal cord, but she'd been mutilated way beyond anything that's seen previously. There are photographs which you can find online if you want to see the imagery, but it is pretty horrendous. Her face had basically been cut off, literally stripped back, nose missing, eyes are sort of protruding out of basically empty face. She'd had all the flesh stripped off of one of her thighs right down to the bone. Basically all her organs had been completely removed, breasts had been cut off and put on a table beside her. Her intestines were wrapped around the room, there was blood everywhere. She was basically destroyed, but the Ripper himself had all the time he wanted to do whatever he was doing. She was seen as late as 2 a.m. in the morning talking to a man, and also speaking to another local person who actually said she saw Mary Jane Kelly alive at 6 a.m., which is absolutely impossible. So we had a definite time window we're looking at, somewhere between sort of 2 a.m. on to the morning at some point. She was found about 11 o'clock in the morning by Thomas Barry, the guy collecting the rent, but certainly the mutilation had taken some time. Some clothes had been burnt in the fire to produce more light, which is interesting because not quite sure who the clothing belonged to, but often people like prostitutes would just pick up clothing as they went along, and she had someone to take it to. I'm trying to remember. Miller's Court. Sorry, I was going to put mind blank there. That's the name of where she was living. Miller's Court, the place is called. And it was, I mean, the East End itself was fairly lawless, but this area was horrendous. It was like basically gangs living in there. It was completely lawless. It was a terrible part of the East End. A lot of local kind of crime gangs were based in that area. And that was it. That was the last murder of any kind like that. Now, there have been many murders have been attributed to the Ripper after that, but nothing like this. This was the worst one. And it stops. It just simply comes to an end. I say there are many murders that happen afterwards, but none of them are anything like this. Nothing like this ferocity or this style of murder. Indeed, the press are quite disappointed, and they start linking any kind of murder across sort of almost across London, trying to tie it in with Jack the Ripper because they want the story to keep going. Because I mean, they're selling newspapers, the sales are through the roof because everyone's lapping it all up. So of course they want to keep the story going for as long as possible. But there's no doubt about it, that was the final murder of its kind. The end.
Oh, but it's not the end.
Oh no, of course not. The end of the murders, though.
Yeah. Really quick, do you think that each victim was more and more mutilated because he needed to do that to accomplish whatever feeling of success or sexual gratification that he was getting by committing the murders?
Absolutely. That's very much it. It's one of those things you get deeper and darker the more you go on with this kind of thing. And again, repeatedly with serial killers, you see this kind of escalation happening. Psychologically speaking, even the FBI did a profile back in the 1980s on the 100th anniversary, but other psychologists have profiled him again. It's the same kind of thing. He's fear and hatred of women. He's being played out in these murders. Excuse the language, but he's dissecting them. He's removing sex organs completely, mutilating and destroying them, but destroying the woman, dissecting them, making them a lump of meat, basically. And that way he's getting out some kind of internal rage or anger towards women. He's probably the typical kind of serial killer who starts off killing animals first, finds that enjoyable, and then later on moves on to people. I mean, that's the thing is, this is the key thing. This is the last murder of this kind. Now, when you're dealing with a serial killer like this, there's only two ways they will stop. They're either caught or killed themselves. No serial killer with this kind of violence, this kind of psychology,
and regularity.
Say again?
And regularity.
Yeah, you don't just stop. You don't think, I've had enough now. That was enough for me. I'm just going to carry on with my normal life. Any proposed identity for the Ripper, any proposed suspect that goes on to have any kind of vaguely normal life after this, that is the proof that they are not the Ripper, because that just does not happen. This is me speaking as a professional psychotherapist, not as a ripperologist. This is someone who has an idea of human psychology. It doesn't happen. The drivers and motivations of this kind of killing in the subconscious are so powerful, you can't stop them. That's the key. People who then say this guy moved off to Australia or Canada or America and did X, Y, Z, then 5 years later started killing in a different way. It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't. You'll get no criminal psychologist will tell you that kind of thing occurs. So you have got this situation where the Ripper, the real Ripper, is either incarcerated or dies. Killed or commit suicide, which again is unlikely. Psychopaths like this rarely commit suicide. More often they're quite happy to revel in their crimes, even if they've been captured and go to prison. They still like to revel in what they've done. It's very rare for them to commit suicide. It does happen with certain kinds of serial killers. Perhaps most famous is probably the worst this country has actually ever produced is Harold Shipman, who killed hundreds of elderly people, basically given lethal injections. Now, he did commit suicide when he was basically caught. But it's a very different kind of killer. He was motivated by money. He was motivated by theft. His wasn't the same kind of psychopathology behind his actions. This kind of violent serial killer, they're not even living in our world anymore. They're in their own reality. And that's the motivation for their crimes. It's not real world stuff that we would understand at the normal level. These were not crimes of passion. They were not crimes of revenge. They were psychopathic mutilations to try and deal with the underlying warping psychology that he was undoubtedly suffering from. So that's one of the big problems. Is most of the people who've been proposed have had some kind of life afterwards, whether, as I say, it's H.H. Holmes and his Murder Palace, people proposing people like Walter Sickett, the artist, that he's supposed to go on and carry on being an artist for years after his murders, which is just impossible. It just doesn't happen. And yet it's become one of those fields that is, until 1970 or so, it was still seen as very niche. It was seen as a serious topic for investigation, that serious possible suspects have been put forward with good evidence towards them. It all changed in 1971 when a magazine called The Criminologist published an article by a retired doctor who claimed that it was the Queen's surgeon was responsible for the Ripper murders. A guy called William Withy Gull, who was the doctor in ordinary to the Queen, that he was responsible for the murders. It was complete nonsense. It didn't really add up. It was based on some supposed confession that was made by somebody, but it just didn't add up. But because there was a link to royalty, the story spread around the world. It suddenly became this big thing that Jack the Ripper was linked to the royal family. And from that moment onwards, it opened the door to a lot of the nonsense we see today that just doesn't add up. But unfortunately, that was when it really changed, when this little article came out. And funny enough, the guy who wrote it, whose name escapes me at the moment, he actually retracted the article in the next edition of the Criminologist, said it didn't really stand up, and then probably died, old age basically. But it didn't add up. You then had Stephen Knight writing a book called Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, which came the Masonic conspiracy. That was all based around the testimony of one person who claimed to be related to excuse me, a member of the royal family, he made up this ridiculous story that the Prince of Wales had married this prostitute woman, that 5 fellow prostitutes knew the secret of this secret royal birth and secret royal marriage. They were going to sort of blackmail the royal family over what they knew, and that they were then bumped off one at a time by Freemasons in mutilating him in some kind of Freemason ritual. It was absolute nonsense. It doesn't stack up at all. The people supposedly involved clearly were doing other things at the same time, or in different parts of the country at the same time, so they couldn't have been out scouring the East End for these women. And the man who made the story up actually retracted it and said to Stephen Knight, sorry mate, I made it all up. And then Stephen Knight dies. He died quite young, and this guy starts trying to claim that no, the story is true, and I want royalties from Stephen Knight's estate because it is a true story, even though he'd actually published in a magazine and in his article he had made it all up. So you've got all this going on. But because, again, it's a royal family, it's secret Masonic conspiracy, it's the sort of thing the public loves. So, of course, it all gets pulled in as being true. But, again, it just doesn't add up. Most of these supposed suspects, when you start to look at the details of who they are and what they're supposed to do, it just never stacks up. There's another one which came out, which claimed the Prince of Wales himself was actually Jack the Ripper, that he died young from influenza, from a cold. But it was claimed that actually died of syphilis and actually went mad and was out in the East End of London, was strolling the streets and murdering people until, the same Withy Gull chap, the Queen's doctor, captured him, took him away, took him to asylum, and he died. Except on one night of the murders, he was actually in Scotland with more than 500 people at a banquet. You know, he was there that night with 500 witnesses saying he was there. And yet still the story that the Prince of Wales or Jack the Ripper is still out there. People still believe it. So there you go. I will now breathe for a moment.
Marianne, do you have any questions?
Well, I'm just waiting to hear his interpretation of who he thinks it really is. I know that one of the top suspects was always Aaron Kosminski, and there was theoretical DNA evidence to link him. There was, of course, his asylum institutionalism that kind of appeared at the same time of the deaths stopping. What's your idea there? Which the guy that you think is the most likely?
Before that, do we need to go back to the 2 gents that saw the?
This ties in with that exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly one of the things that ties in. Now, I want to talk briefly about that idea of the DNA. Now, it's again, I've discussed it with the guy who came up with the DNA theory. I'm not going to name his name because I've forgotten it off the top of my head. But there are 2 kinds of DNA that can be tested for. Mm-hmm. They tested for the less commonly tested one. I'm still not entirely sure where they got the DNA from this Kosminski person from, but apparently it matched up. The piece of the shawl, from what I remember, again, is possibly linked to one of the victims. My brain's starting to stop working for a while, but it's Kathy Eddowes. Now, we do know for definite that part of her apron was found in a place called Galston Street, which is some way from Mitre Square. Now, Galston Street has become quite famous because of the graffiti that was written on the wall. Have you heard about that? The Galston Street graffiti?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Absolutely.
You know, either the Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing, or the Jews are not the men who will not be blamed for nothing. The double negatives are in there just to confuse you, indicating that maybe it's the Jews, but the bizarre spelling of Juwes. Right. But what's often left out is the fact that it was removed on the orders of...
the constable.
Probably Charles Warren, the head of the police, basically wanted it removed because it was getting light and he was concerned that the locals would see it and start lynching Jews in the street. But what was agreed by both the principal detectives there and Charles Warren, who was called to it, and Inspector Aberlin, was it was old. It was old and faded. It wasn't written new at all. But because the piece of apron was found, which definitely belonged to Kathy Eddowes, it basically could put it back in its place in the apron she was wearing, which had blood and feces on it, then this was what linked the graffiti to the Ripper. But it's not the case at all. It's got no link whatsoever. There's big conspiracy saying about, it should have been photographed, but there wasn't time to get a camera there, enough light for it to photograph. It would then become visible to the locals. And with all the police swarming around the area, it was dangerous. Unfortunately, it wasn't photographed, it was removed, but they were all in agreement it was old. And yet that still plays a big part of the Masonic conspiracy theory, that these Juwes was some kind of Masonic link, proving the Masonic conspiracy. So again, it's one of these things, a lot of these things on the surface look really interesting and possible, but until you get into the detail, they just don't add up. But Kosminski as the name of the Ripper, I think, is the most likely. Now, there are problems, there's no doubt about it, about the identification of it. But what really swings it is this whole thing, what they call the three suspects list, because often people think that at the time the police had no idea who it was and it was all confusion and mystery and no knowledge. But there was very real idea in the police's minds as to who the Ripper was. And so this list of 3 names had been put together. Again, only for the police's eyes, nobody else's, that includes the name Kosminski. It also included Montague John Druitt and the third name, Michael Ostrog. Now, we can go through the 3 if you want, because I think they're the important ones, because it's the evidence towards these 3 that are stronger than anybody else. One of the earliest real strong theorising was towards the idea of Montague John Druitt, because he did commit suicide. Now, the 3 suspects list includes this guy saying that he drowned at the end of December. His actual body wasn't found until January, and he definitely did commit suicide because he left a suicide note saying he thought he was going like mother. His mum had depressive issues and problems. Now, it's all circumstantial. There's no particular reason why you'd think this guy was a Ripper, other than the fact he kills himself. But as I said before, this kind of serial killers don't kill themselves. There's no doubt about it. It wouldn't stop that way. So although prima facie he looked like a possible suspect because of the fact that he committed suicide, he thought he was going mad. But as I say, those who knew, even at the time who knew psychology would say, well, that's not a reason, because you wouldn't do that. The Michael Ostrog one is a bit of a mystery, how his name even got in there. It took a long time to even find a Michael Ostrog, but when they did, he was a Russian confidence trickster who had violent tendencies with a knife, but never killed anybody, never even stabbed anybody. He just threatened people with a knife. His thing was more confidence trickery of stealing money. So how his name got on the list is a bit of a mystery. But the middle one, Aaron Kosminski, or someone Kosminski or Kosminski, is by far the most likely. What makes it really interesting is, you know about the Swanson marginalia? Have we talked about that before?
The what now?
The Swanson marginalia?
No.
You know anything about that? Oh, this is where it really starts to come together. Just briefly, Dr. Robert Anderson was the Commissioner of Police at the time. He was the head of the CID. He had appointed Donald Swanson as his deputy and the overall in charge of the Ripper case. Years go by, Dr. Robert Anderson retires and writes his memoirs of his time as a police officer called The Lighter Side of My Official Life, which was published in 1910. In it, he discusses the Ripper case, but doesn't name anybody as being the Ripper. Years and years later, in 1987, the grandson of Donald Swanson discovers his grandfather's copy of Robert Anderson's book, in which Donald Swanson had written some notes about the Ripper case. As I say, he listed, there were 3 suspects. There's one person in particular that they believe was Jack the Ripper, and he was confronted with witnesses to him being the Ripper, i.e. the 2 guys I was talking about. But they refused to comment and sign affidavits saying that this was the man they'd seen. Without their evidence, they couldn't convict the guy. They had to let him go. But he was quickly reincarcerated later on and then dies in an asylum. Okay, there's no name mentioned, and there's no reason listed why the guys would not identify him. And Swanson wrote in his own book, with his own mind, with his memory, he wrote exactly this. He wrote, because the suspect was also a Jew, and also because his evidence would have convicted the suspect, and witnesses by the means of the murderer being hanged, and they did not want that left on their conscience, left on their mind. After this identification, which the suspect knew, no other murders of this kind took place in London. After the suspect had been identified at the seaside home, and I'll come back to that in a minute, where he'd been sent by us with difficulty in order for the subject to be identified, and he knew he'd been identified. On the subject's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by the city CID day and night, and a short time after, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, was sent to the Stepney Workhouse and then on to Coney Hatch Asylum, and died soon afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect. This is what Swanson himself wrote. So he's identifying Aaron Kosminski. This is his own book, his own copy, for his own own memory. It's not for any publication or anybody else to see. And Swanson, who's in charge of the overall case, is convinced it was Aaron Kosminski. And the two people, who the witnesses who identified this particular person, were the two, I believe, that came out of Mitre Square, who saw this man leaving. And they believe was the Ripper, because it was literally probably minutes after the murders took place. I know I'm not the only person who thinks that. I know others don't agree with me, but certainly there are others who think the same as I do, that that's what was going on. That because these two men were coming from a Jewish association club nearby, near Mitre Square, and they recognised the guy maybe as being a fellow Jew or someone they actually knew, they wouldn't identify, because it was very much this kind of, a lot of these Jews that come from Eastern Europe where they were experiencing pretty awful treatment, pogroms and other violence, and the idea of the police being anything other than their enemy was a real problem for them. So they're handing over one of their own people to the police who in other countries had persecuted them would be very much at odds with their own thinking. So the fact that they wouldn't identify them, and they can't make them identify them in those days, there's nothing they could do, and they very refused. Then that was it. The Seaside Home thing was interesting because as early as 1887, police officers who'd had a difficult time, either suffered from injuries or even emotional trauma, were sent to a home in Brighton for recovery for a period of time. And what it looks like has happened was that this guy was taken there, well out of the East End, in the hopes that perhaps they'd be more likely to identify him because they were out of the East End area, but it didn't happen. Now, there are problems because Kosminski, the only one that could be found, Aaron Kosminski, actually lived on until 1919. The medical records describe him as being a harmless imbecile, more obsessed with his own internal thinking than anything else, but no history of violence or criminality or anything like that at all. So that doesn't really tie in with what Swanson is saying about Kosminski. So there is a bit of a problem there. But, and this is the fascinating thing, one of the, I think, the most serious researchers who wanted to look into this area really kind of dug in deeper into more records. A chap called Martin Fido. He found a man who was identified as being David Cohen was arrested in December 1888, raving outside a brothel, with the records describing him as being violent and having to be restrained and incoherent. He was given the name David Cohen because they didn't know what his identity was, much like in America, if you don't know someone's name, they call him John Doe. But if they know he's Jewish, he gets called David Cohen. There's actually a House of Lords report on this fact that this name is given to unidentified Jewish males. He goes to Colney Hatch Asylum and dies the year after, in 1889. Now, he, in terms of description of what he was like as a person, fits with what Swanson's saying. The name mix-up may come from a possibility of perhaps a memory of the fact that Swanson was writing this about 18 years later after the case. One of the other possibilities is that the two main police forces that were involved in investigating were the City CID and the Metropolitan CID. Now, they cover obviously different parts of the east of London. They don't get on at all as police forces. They're actually very much rivals of each other. But because of some of the murders were in the City of Police's territory, i.e. Mitre Square, whereas some of the early murders are in the Metropolitan Police areas, this murder is crossing over the two patches. And the idea that they would compete with each other to identify the Ripper and potentially mix up people is quite possible. And Martin Fido suggests, and I think he's right, that basically they've misidentified Kosminski. He's actually this David Cohen guy. But the description of what Cohen's like very much fits with what Swanson's saying of Kosminski. They're both definitely Jewish, both definitely probably Polish origin, because the vast majority of Jews in East London were from Poland. You remember, I think you realise that at that time there was no country called Poland. It was actually completely subsumed into Russia, and they were treating them pretty terribly. So a lot of them were coming over to the UK to get away from the violence. So that kind of ties it all up, that this David Cohen almost certainly, because of the way he's described his actions, the idea that he'd gone so far with his killings he literally lost control completely again is quite possible. That psychologically speaking, he got so far that there's no further to go, to be found raving violent outside a brothel just in December, only a few weeks after the last murder, and be arrested at that point certainly fits in with the idea that the Ripper stopped because he was captured. The fact that David Cohen dies in 1889 in Colney Hatch, the same asylum that Swanson's talking about, but as I say, not 1919, in 1889, only a year later, fits with what Swanson's saying. So take all that together. I keep saying this Swanson marginalia was for his own benefit, not for anyone's publication. It was for him alone. And Fat James Swanson, who found it, sat on it for a few years, not sure what the hell to do with it. So he's identifying for his own benefit that he believes it was Kosminski, but there is this possible mix-up with identification with Cohen. So there you go. That's what I think.
Forgive me if I missed it, but what was the cause of death for Cohen?
Doesn't say. There's no. It's just that he died in 1889 in the asylum. So I don't know. It's quite possible that maybe a heart condition or something along those lines. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe he did some, I don't know, tie a chair around his head or something. I don't know. Don't know the details. But I only know that he definitely did die in 1889. Again, there's no record of exactly what killed this other Kosminski chap in 1919. Could be just age, could be all sorts, it could be cancer for all we know. You know, right. It wasn't really that well known in those days. But as I say, the Coney Hatch record showing being entering in December and dying in 1889. I think it was October, I think, off the top of my head, but it was certainly later in the following year.
Well, and being in an asylum, I mean, they could have been attacked by another patient, too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was violent himself. It's quite possible that he got into a fight with somebody else, and they were bigger and stronger than he was, and very possibly. I mean, they were hell on earth, those places in those days. Mm-hmm. They really were the nastiest of possible places you can imagine. They didn't know what to do with these people. There was no medication as such that was any help to them. There was no counseling or therapy. It was literally just treated as animals, particularly these kind of violent ones. There was nothing done with them. It was just, let's wait for them to die, basically. So, yeah.
They weren't doing, lobotomies or shock therapy at that point?
Not in those days, no. No, that comes somewhat later. I mean, the beginnings of psychology was happening and somewhat was being done. I mean, that may well have been lobotomized or a very basic form, or electroshock therapy, again, wasn't really around until the 1910s and 20s, really. So that wasn't unlikely either. Just a day-to-day kind of sort of drudgery of stuck in these rooms, probably rambling to themselves, throwing themselves around the room. So he could well have just simply thrown himself against the wall and back crashed his head open, for all I know. You know? Right. But certainly, as I say, for that kind of violent serial killer, I mean, I'm not trying to beat myself up here, but anybody that has a psychological background in any kind of training will understand the psychopathology behind the actions and the likely outcome of being that kind of vile, violent serial killer is going to be a short life in one form or another, unless they're cared for, properly looked after. I mean, a psychopath like this killing in the 1980s will be treated very differently, of course, now. I mean, it depends where you are in the States. You may well get the injection, of course, electric chair, whatever. Over here, they'd be institutionalized, and there would be attempts to try and rehabilitate them. They never see the light of day again. They'll never be free, but they might give them sort of counselling and therapy, either sort of medicational therapy or psychotherapy. But they would be treated differently to how they are now, because there's a much better understanding that a psychopath is not, even this kind of violent serial killer is not considered to be insane. That's a different category, but they're considered to be obviously unsafe and shouldn't ever be let out.
Right, absolutely. Marianne, you being the history buff, I know you must have some questions.
Well, I wanted to hear his information that he had on the DNA testing.
Only that, as far as I know. When I've talked to Edwards about it, I forget his first name, it's going off the top of my head. The problem that even he kind of accepts is that, how do you know this is the right Herman Kosminski DNA from in the first place? You know, that DNA of the murderer is supposed to be on. How do you know it's the right person? I mean, I've just identified here where it might be the wrong Kosminski anyway. It might be the wrong person. There is a Kaminsky as well that was around the time. The other thing I forgot to mention was that there was no known relatives of Aaron Kosminski, but David Cohen had a brother that they believe this guy was living in. I mean, again, this is just people identifying the guy as coming and going from this house because he was incoherent at the time. But when they tried to identify him in the immediate area, some said he had a brother, a guy called Wolf Cohen, who lived not very far from Galston Street. In actual fact, if you draw a straight line from Mitre Square to where Wolf Cohen lived, if it is David Cohen's brother, then it goes straight through Galston Street. Literally, that's the route you take to go home. Kosminski lived nowhere near, this Kosminski that they talk about lived nowhere near that particular area. There wouldn't be a reason why he'd been at Galston Street. So that thing, but again, the caveat is if Wolf Cohen was David Cohen's brother. It's only that they said the guy looked like him because they didn't know what this guy's name was. And they say he's given the name Cohen because it's such a common name anyway. So it could be that he's given that actual name. But say my wife's maiden name's Cohen. So that's where the joke comes in about David Cohen. But as far as I understand, now I'm not an expert in DNA at all, but there are two kinds of DNA to be tested for, and they tested for the less often tested version. And again, the question comes, and I did talk to, I forget the guy's name, you know, how do you know that DNA that you're testing against is the definite Jack the Ripper? Didn't really answer the question other than say read his book, which of course would be a dry answer, really. But again, we've talked about it, we've discussed it, and we're both in the same ballpark, if you like. We're both saying Kosminski is the killer, and I'm happy to go on record and say Aaron Kosminski, yeah, he fits. There are problems, and I think David Cohen explains those. But the idea of the poor Polish Jew in the area is by far the best suspect, shall we say?
And that's Cohen.
Yeah, Cohen Kosminski.
So Kaminsky and Cohen is the same guy.
I think so. I think he's misidentified. Yes. But rather than saying that the Aaron Kosminski that is found is the guy that lives till 1919 has been a harmless imbecile. That's the one that's generally put as being that guy. But I'm saying this David Cohen is the actual Ripper, and there's a mix-up of names. But we're talking about the same kind of person, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, because of the way he was acting when he was, in front of the brothel that led him to
exactly.
Institutionalized.
Absolutely. As I say, the Aaron Kosminski that's arrested, I'm not entirely sure where the capture and arrest of Aaron Kosminski takes place, but as I say, there's nothing in his record in the Coney Hatch or Stepney Workhouse to suggest he was ever violent. He seemed very much obsessed with his own internal thinking, didn't like taking a bath, and his actions don't suggest that of a violent psychopathic killer. This other guy, say, is identified as David Cohen, has even given that name as David Cohen, or potentially Wolf Cohen's brother, certainly was the violent, psychopathic, murderous intent. You say he was raving outside, he had to be restrained. When he was brought to the courthouse, he was still in restraints because he was liable to attack people. That fits with a psychopath who's finally just lost the plot completely. And so when you've got this building escalation of violence that you've got with Jack the Ripper, then for him to end up suddenly a harmless imbecile just doesn't add up. It really doesn't work that way. But someone who continued to remain violent and attack anybody who approached him, which is what this guy had got to the point he was like, that certainly fits with the violent psychopath that Jack the Ripper clearly was.
Now, when he was raving in front of the brothel and then was, taken to court and institutionalized, did the investigators stop to think, okay, maybe this guy is the Ripper and we should interview him?
Well, yes, that's what I'm saying. I think that's the mistake that Swanson's making. I think he's mixing the two up. Now, it is quite possible that one force, the city police, took the Metropolitan Police's prime suspect, i.e. David Cohen, took him away to be identified by their witnesses, and might have said to the witnesses, this guy we believe is called Aaron Kosminski, do you recognise him? And they've said, yes, we are, and then we're not going to say it's him. That's what I think is more likely. Again, this is also what Martin Filer said, that because these two forces competed with each other, didn't share information, they may well have nabbed their suspect and said, look, we want to use it to identify him. We may have picked him off the street and said, look, you've been arrested, we want to put you before our potential witnesses. A guy called Donald Rumbelow, who was a former police sergeant who, upon retirement, used to run the Black Museum, which is this museum of crime in London, and is obviously a retired police officer, knows this area far better than I do, and he said the same, that there's a very good possibility that they just mixed people up because they were competing against each other. Particularly in this kind of case, you want to be the police force that solves the Jack the Ripper murders. You want to that fame, because it was, by this point, it was international. It was appearing in newspapers around the world, these killings, because they were so unusual. So the idea that you might misidentify a suspect in order to claim the glory of capturing him is entirely possible.
Wow.
And it's mad, isn't it?
It really is.
So you've got two people that are similar in terms of their ethnicity, their location of where they lived. As I say, Aaron Kosminski is believed to have lived alone. David Cohen may have lived with Wolf Cohen, an older brother, because they identified this guy was shown to the locals who lived there and said, yeah, that's his brother. Again, we don't know because the records aren't that good. Unfortunately, on the beat police officers' notes are never very good. It's usually the higher levels, if you like, of the police force who collate all the bits of information, produce their reports, if you like, that have this information. And the original notes, when those were discarded, now they're all filed away, they'll be discarded. And reports were built around those notes, and the notes themselves are then forgotten about. And often there were inconsistencies and disagreements about who said what and when and where. So there's confusion. Like I said, with the Liz Stride, there were two witnesses, both saying the same thing but opposite directions, one being pulled towards the yard, the other being pulled away from the yard. So they were both quite firm. That's, it's pretty obvious whether something being pulled one direction or the other, but yet both witnesses apparently said the same. But one witness was speaking English, and the other witness was Jewish, speaking in Yiddish. So there could be mistranslation of the Yiddish. Again, we don't entirely know. So either on the ground, there's confusion. When you get a bit further up, when people are collating the information and building cases and building timelines, it starts to look more coherent.
Right.
I always get this when I have interviews. I stop talking and there's like a deathly silence. Like I often think,
we're observing it all.
About that. I often think, oh, that's interesting. Or what the hell is he talking about? And I've just lost people completely.
So mind blowing. I did have a question, and now I've forgotten it.
Blimey, it's me again. I do that to people. I'm sorry.
It was the From Hell letter.
Oh yes. The thing is, it was more than likely from the third victim, Kathy Eddowes, although it's been suggested it was the second victim. As I said, there's a little bit of confusion there. But the letter was sent to George Lusk, who was the head of the Vigilance Committee, as it was called. And the letter basically says, I took half a kidney, I cooked half of it and ate it, and I'm sending you the t'other piece. And he said, I'll send you the bloody knife if you wait long enough.
Right, and there was the other a portion of a liver sent with that letter.
There was a piece of kidney, but, and this is where this confusion happens. The official kind of line story, not appears in the books, it was taken to an eminent doctor who identified it as being a woman's and being ginny, as in like drank a lot of gin. Now, there's a problem, because when you actually look at the actual records, the doctor the newspaper went to wasn't in, and his very inexperienced junior said it was possibly a woman's kidney and maybe ginny, as in a drinker. You cannot identify at that time in medical knowledge whether a kidney was male or female.
Not
at
by
that point.
No
way of knowing. Also, the thing could have what's called Bright's disease, which could give the impression of being gin-soaked, and there's no way of testing at that particular point. So there's no way of knowing who that kidney belonged to. And there were, more than likely, what you've got is rather silly medical students, and again, they were caught doing this, sending things like this in, send bits of bodies in, claiming they were taken from a murder victim. In actual fact, there was a body in a morgue. That certainly happened. The language of the letter of all the letters suggests someone with more intelligence trying to write as if they're less intelligent, correctly spelling complicated words and misspelling simple words and things like that, like SUR, S-U-R. It's just attempting to sound less intelligent than they actually were.
It could have been an animal kidney.
I would think he's probably right. It was probably human, but again, you could easily require one if you work in a hospital from a cadaver. Very easy, really.
These days, yeah.
But I mean, none of the letters really stack up. I mean, there were literally hundreds of them sent to the police. It was only the fact that a few of them, and 3 in fact, used the name Jack the Ripper. That was another reason why it became so well known, because it's such a catchy name, Jack the Ripper. Indeed, I cannot forget who it was exactly, but one writer actually identified it may well have been a writer for a newspaper called The Star that actually wrote the letters. It was pretty much in his handwriting, apparently, and I couldn't find the reference before we did the show. But he's been identified as may well have been the actual author of the letters, and every one of the letters was posted after the fact. Every one of the letters contained information that was in the public domain at the time. There was nothing new or nothing secretive that was in the letters that was unknown. So, again, any attempt to say these letters written by the Ripper is daft, because this kind of killer would not have written to the press. Some serial killers certainly do. I mean, most famous is the Zodiac Killer in America, in your neck of the woods, where he did write and taunt the police with these mysterious codes. But again, he's a different kind of killer. He's not the violent, psychopathic murderer that Jack the Ripper was. That kind of killer does not write to the press, does not write to anybody. There's a good chance to say if he's a young Polish immigrant, the chance he might not even be able to write English, much less write letters and send them to the police. So, it really doesn't add up. But it's sensationalist. It builds the story, it builds a narrative. So, of course, it gets added in.
And I could see, an employee of the newspaper doing that just to increase, like you said, because the newspapers are flying off the shelves with the Jack the Ripper stories. So why not keep that ball rolling, right? And just...
Absolutely.
Yep.
So there's even a bigger story behind it as well. In 1887, there was a very large march all the way to Trafalgar Square against poverty and joblessness. And the police at the time, headed by Charles Warren, basically couldn't handle the size of the demonstrations. So they called in the army, and there were violence and deaths ensued through that. And the press absolutely turned on Charles Warren, really wanted him out of the job. So then you have a series of very violent unsolved murders in the East End. It's yet another opportunity to bash the police and bash Charles Warren in particular. So they jumped all over it. It was all political. It was that kind of, here's an opportunity to give the police another good kick in for what they did last year. We're going to jump all over it. And as you're saying, the newspapers sales were through the roof. So of course they're going to want to keep it going. And, we know about problems with fake news in modern times. You imagine what like in those days. You stick a fake letter in the post. There's no way of proving it was fake. And off it goes, appears in the newspaper, and it sells millions. It's crazy. That, unfortunately, is very much how it works. And that's one of the biggest problems of the Ripper story. There's so much hype around it. It really is. I mean, say, there are hundreds of names that have been put forward from the vaguely possible to the outright ludicrous. But unless they can explain why these violent killings suddenly stopped, if they can't explain that, then, forget it. It's not worth seriously considering, because it doesn't work that way. Human psychology does not work that way. The killer was either killed or stopped in one way or another. Right. And that brings back to this primary suspect of Aaron Kosminski. I mean, he's all circumstantial, of course it is, but I think if it was less famous a case, it would have been solved. It would have been like, yeah, okay, this is the guy. Aaron Kosminski is the killer. We'll move on. But because there's such a massive media industry around it, I mean, you say Jeff's TV show was only a couple of years ago. It's been repeated ad infinitum at the moment. So there's money to be made. So, of course, people who are tour guides, writers, they don't want the case solved because it was the end of the gravy train. Fair enough. They would also argue it's 120 odd years ago. So why do anyone care about being solved now anyway? Most people don't give a damn. It's only nutters like me who are that fascinated who want to try and get to the truth of it. But, there's not enough evidence to prove that anybody was a Ripper. But I think in sheer volume of available evidence, the finger pointing at Kosminski / Cohen is pretty good. It's not outside those guys. It's one of those two. And I think, as I say, it is Cohen mixed up with Kosminski because of the misidentification due to the fact the guy was very possibly pretty much kidnapped by the other police force.
That is just so crazy.
Yes. It hurts one's head to think about.
It really does. It's like the politics were more important than justice.
Oh, absolutely. In those days, I mean, much
it
today
still is
today. I mean, it very much so. But there isn't. We have much more of what you might call the cult of the individual today. Lots more individual rights are being more important. These in a crappy sort of East End lawless kind of immigrants flooding in, sort of no jobs and overcrowded and desolate. Kind of no one cared. It didn't matter. Unfortunately, there was a murder a week easily in the East End at that time. Most of them went completely unnoticed, unreported. What started off being interesting was the violence, but then that began to kind of escalate around itself because people were more interested. So of course they made it more salacious. More stories started coming out. There were reports. I mean, one of the biggest misnomers is the Ripper was a doctor. That comes from one report on one murder. That one of the cuts in Kathy Eddowes' body in Mitre Square was very clean, single slash of the knife to loosen the uterus. And that was done like an expert was the quote, words along those lines. And that was jumped on saying, it's obviously a doctor. He knows what he's doing. The fact that the other in the uterus was actually smashed to pieces and was slashed to God knows what because he couldn't cut it properly is ignored. So that is one line in this one part. The press jumped all over it saying Dr. Ripper is the doctor. Look out for doctors. But the fact is, anybody in the East End of London who didn't look like they belonged there at that time were pretty much lynched. You were surrounded. You couldn't walk around the East End not looking like you belonged in the area because there were vigilance committees. There were lynch mobs out there. People were being attacked in the streets. People were being dragged into the police stations, being identified as being this strange, mysterious, unknown person. So anybody who looked even vaguely out of place would have been noticed pretty quickly. Someone with an American accent walking around would notice straight away. Anyone who was dressed fairly well would stand out a mile.
Right.
This is the other problem with people like H.H. Holmes because, you look at that man's face, he's clearly very disturbed anyway. It was a different kind of psychopathology, as I say, but, if he opened his mouth and started speaking an American accent, they were like, oh my God, what's that? You know, the EastEnders would never have heard an American accent before. You know, we don't have the media like we've got now. It would have stood out a mile.
Which only leaves someone that is local.
Exactly. And a poor Jewish immigrant would have fitted in completely, would have gone unnoticed. I mean, one of the things they talk about is the fact that he seemed almost magical ability to disappear. No, he knew the territory. He knew the back alleyways. Remember, there was no lighting in those days. There was some gas lights on the main street. Yeah. But the back alleys and the side roads where he would have been down, there would be nothing. I'll tell you a quick funny little story. I was mentioned very briefly earlier on about the Duffield's Yard, the first of the double event, which I say I don't think was a murder necessarily, but where it is now, Duffield's Yard was demolished decades ago, nearly a century ago, and a school stands there now since the 1920s, I think. Opposite the school is a block of flats, and at the basement of the block of flats there used to be a club called the Oxford and St George Club, which is a Jewish club for local people who lived in the area. My wife's parents got married, sort of legally, if you like, but they were married a second time by the guy who ran the club. It's kind of like a joke thing, a little synagogue down there, like a Jewish wedding down there as well. And when my wife took me to where it was, I was like, "Do you know what used to be across the road?" "No." Duffield's Yard is literally across the road. It would have been from where my wife's parents got married. Wow. The Enrique Street Club. It was like, yeah, my God, yeah. And when you look, some clever sod had actually sprayed on the floor. Jack the Ripper was here. He sprayed on the floor. It was literally the entrance to the Enrique Street Club and Duffield's Yard were opposite each other, or would have been, as I say. It's long since gone. So that was quite amazing. Bloody hell. She had no idea. I mean, she'd heard of the Ripper, but no idea about the fact it was that close to where her parents' club that she and my wife went as a kid herself. It was closed in the 1980s, I think it was. So that was quite fun. As I say, I lived in the area for a number of years. I'm not from originally, but I've always been fascinated by it. And as I say, when I moved to the East End for university, I had a good tour around the sites. I mean, I take friends or relatives around the sites and tell them the story of the Ripper. So
yeah, it's on my bucket list. I need to get over there and do that myself because
yeah. I'll give you a tour.
I'd love it. Well, but speaking of tours, you're coming to my end of the country.
I am indeed, yes. I don't think you could get further away in mainland USA than to Seattle from the UK, but there I am coming, indeed.
So did you want to promote that event?
I could talk about it, I suppose, yes. It's in the 15th and 16th of September, so a couple of weeks' time. I'm speaking at the... Let me just get back on screen. I had it and I've just lost it. I've just lost it. And there it is. Come back to me. There we go. It is the Mortlake & Company's Esoteric Book Fair and Colloquium. It's a weekend of conference talks, me being one of the speakers on various topics to do with the esoteric and the occult. There's also a book fair with all the main publishers will be in attendance. It's at the Greenwood Masonic Lodge in Greenwood North Avenue in Seattle, where you live, where you're abiding at the moment. And I'm speaking there. One of a number of speakers. I'm talking about something called the Citra Acra, which is the evil side of the Kabbalah, or is it? There's actually more to it than that. But I'm giving a talk about a book I'm currently working on, which is my fourth book, which will hopefully be out next year. It should have been finished by the end of this year, but I doubt I'm going to get it finished before the end of the year, I have to be honest with you. And as I say, I'm speaking at the conference. There are about a dozen different publishers who are going to be in attendance and say obviously selling their wares. And there are a number of talks, of which I am the very first speaker on the first day, which I'm quite pleased about because it means I can get my talk out of the way and enjoy the whole rest of the weekend without having to worry about having to do my talk, which is quite nice. Despite my waffling on for ages here, I'm not a big fan of public speaking. It kind of comes with the territory a bit, so I have to kind of get used to doing these things, but I'm not the most comfortable of doing them, I have to say. But they want me there, so I shall be there. My talk is called The Origins of Darkness. The first glimpses of the Citra Acra, which is to say is the evil side of impurity, the side of darkness, if you like. But it's not hell. Hell's something different, which is interesting in itself. And I say it's often linked to the evil side of the Kabbalah, a thing called the clip-off. But my book is arguing quite strongly that actually the Citra Acra and the clip-off are two different things. So there we go.
For our listeners out there that don't know the definition of esoteric, could you let us know what that means?
Yes, sure. I try to avoid the word occult because people tend to get all the wrong idea, expect sort of black magic and Satanism and evil and dark and whatever. So I tend to prefer the term esoteric, which basically means the same kind of thing. Occult really kind of just means hidden, and esoteric means kind of mystery. So it's the esoteric tradition, if you like, rather than the occult, because people tend to have the wrong idea about the occult. They think of Satanism as in this sort of devil worship and sacrificing people and babies and animals, that kind of stuff, and it's a world away from that entirely. We're much more kind of, I suppose, academic-ish in terms of we're trying to be more serious. We're not sort of trying to be kind of all hair and scare, and we're trying to be normal, I suppose, is a way of putting it, rather than being too strange and wonderful. Nothing's wrong with that, of course. I've been through my own phases of looking weird and wonderful. I just look more normal these days, going bald and rather overweight. So we're trying to be the kind of more serious end of the scale. We're practitioners and interested in how it actually works, but a lot of it's kind of dealing with the theory and the philosophy behind this sort of stuff. So I say esoteric tends to be preferred because people don't necessarily know what it means, and it doesn't have the weight, if you like, of the word occult.
Yeah,
weighing it down.
General population, when they hear the word occult, that's what they picture is, black mass and virgin sacrifices and that type of stuff, which is, ridiculous. We both know that, but
absolutely. It's the funny thing is that we tend to be a little bit more laid back in the UK. We tend to be a bit more cynical about that kind of stuff. It tends to be, I'm afraid, a little bit more kind of American thing, that expecting that's going to happen straight away. Although, of course, you do get a few problems here. But, I've got a strong believing Baptist as a relative of mine, and she's always fascinated to read what I'm writing about them. I mean, she probably thinks I'm possessed by the devil, but we get all right with it, and we talk about this sort of stuff. So, but yeah, and it is unfortunate people do have certain preconceptions about this sort of thing. And until you really start to dig in and look at it, like the Ripper story, if you like, there's a lot of sensationalism that surrounds it that doesn't really belong there. It's kind of been added in by the media.
And what's even weirder about you coming and doing your lecture on the 15th, which I believe is a Saturday, it's also my birthday.
Yes, this is getting too bizarre for words. Maybe you are supposed to be sacrificed on your birthday.
I'm not a virgin. I'll tell you that right now.
Well, we don't mind. Sometimes you have to take me a guess. He's what's available to you. But it's a funny coincidence. As I obviously we've arranged to meet up, which is great. And
I think that the universe has put this together, and even stranger is the Greenwood Masonic building where the event is taking place over the weekend, and where you will be speaking. It's just literally, and I'm 10 blocks from where I grew up. I've walked by that building thousands of times, have always wanted to go into that building. So when you sent me the link of, where you were speaking, I just lost. I'm like, okay, not only is it on my birthday, but it's at the Greenwood Masonic Lodge. This is like too insane. It's getting too creepy now.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's meant to be.
It absolutely was meant to be. So I'm very excited to meet you. I'm very excited to hear your talk. Looking very much forward to it. Is this your first trip to Seattle?
First to Seattle. I've been to New York a few times, and I really like it over there. I would say it's the first time I've been out of New York, shall we say. So I am looking forward to it, because I've never been anywhere near that part of the States. I know it's probably best known for being the very first Starbucks and the Seattle Needle and all that kind of stuff. So we're hoping to visit there. I'm there from the Wednesday onwards, so I'll get a good couple of days to kind of acclimatise myself to it. One thing I'm struggling with at the moment is I do talk rather quickly, as you've probably noticed. I'm trying to slow myself down for this talk, because it's quite a complex topic I'm getting into, and I don't want to lose my audience within 5 minutes of starting, so I'm trying to slow myself down. But once I get into talking about something, I do tend to get rattle off 100 miles an hour, so I do apologise for that. But yeah, it's just, there was too many coincidences, really. It's just crazy that you can come along and enjoy the day and see inside the building itself as well. So I've never seen inside before. So I keep seeing photographs. I'm trying to figure out from the photographs exactly where the hell I'm speaking, because I've seen a large room, which I assume is where the bookstores are going to be. And then there's basically one of the Masonic rooms is set out for the Freemason type stuff. And I can actually be speaking in there, which is interesting in itself. Us occultists sneaking into the Freemason lodge is quite interesting.
Yeah, if they let us that part of the building, and that's where you're going to be giving the lecture, that's going to over the moon. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I should maybe get some Masonic robes or something. I'm not a Freemason myself, but I have relatives who are, so I should perhaps borrow their aprons and turn up.
Yes.
That would be funny in its own way. But no, I'm really looking forward to it. As I say, it's nice to see another part of the States. As I say, I've been to New York a few times, and I do really enjoy it there, and hoping to go again soon. But to see a different part entirely, I'm looking forward to that as well. So I'm looking forward to meeting you, of course, absolutely.
The West Coast is definitely a lot different than the East Coast.
Mm-hmm. I've actually got relatives who live in South.
I won't spoil it for you. You'll be very pleasantly surprised, I think.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Absolutely. I've got relatives who live down sort of Los Angeles way, and we keep saying San Francisco way. I do apologise. And we're supposed to be going to visit them first. That was the plan. And suddenly this came up, and I thought, well, okay, fair enough. I must admit, my publisher is helping to foot the bill for the trip, which is very nice of him. So I'm like their keynote speaker for my publisher for this particular conference, which is very nice indeed. So put a lot of faith in me, so I have to make sure I don't let them down. Which means just trying to talk more slowly, which I'm not very good at, I have to say. It's ironic because when I'm working as a therapist, I do talk very slowly, very concisely, very relaxed manner. For some bizarre reason, I can only do it when I'm talking to a client. I can't keep this kind of way of speaking up for very long outside of my work environment, which is all part of being a therapist, I suppose. But I want to talk at this sort of speed most of the time, but I totally fail at it, as you probably noticed. So,
well, I think it's because you're passionate about what you're talking about. Versus, not that you're not passionate about, you're helping your patients and all of that, but you're doing that the right way. And then when you're talking about Jack the Ripper or esoteric knowledge books, what have you, that's your passion. So you're excited. You're talking faster. You're more boisterous. You're just because it's such a passionate subject for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as I want to deliver it a little better than I do. And I hope I haven't lost the audience for your show this evening.
No, your presentation on Jack the Ripper was fantastic. I mean, you got a phenomenal amount of information out clearly, concisely, in the accurate timeline, and we're still needing to go another 20 minutes.
Well, have you guys any questions at all about? I mean, Marianne's been rather quiet. I hope she's not disappeared off. Any questions about any of this? I'm more than happy to try and either answer or bat off if I can't figure out the answer to them.
See, I don't really so much have questions about the actual case or anything like that, because again, I've studied some of the history in that as well. As Marie had mentioned, I'm pretty much a history buff, but I'm more interested in your opinions of things that have happened with the case throughout history. That's where I sit at.
Sure. No, as I say, I find that the DNA stuff is fascinating in itself, and as I say, it's bugging me. I can't remember the guy's name. I've talked to him a few times about it as well. We're in the same ballpark, as you guys like to say. We're in the same kind of field of agreement of the identity of the person. I just find it. One of the things that floated around in the 1980s was this idea that they'd found the Ripper's knife. That this knife is being paraded around on TV programs as being Jack the Ripper's without a doubt. Now, in its physical appearance, it fitted with the description of what they believed was the knife. As I say, it was a long, thin, narrow pointed blade, and this was a long, thin, narrow pointed blade. It was actually a surgeon's knife from the 1800s, but it was revealed later on that it belonged to the family of Montague John Druitt, who were a family of doctors. But Druitt himself has been eliminated because the way he committed suicide and the suicide note and his own movements mean it's highly unlikely, almost impossible, he was the Ripper. So you get these items being paraded around to say that this belongs to the Ripper, this is proof of the Ripper, etc., but without giving the full backstory. And I don't know the full backstory to the evidence that this DNA belonged to Aaron Kosminski, whether it's the Kosminski that was identified by Swanson or the mistaken Kosminski. I don't know. So I've always had problems with that particular part of it. And it's bugging me the guy's name. He's a good salesman, so I've talked to him a few times.
Is it the Jared Lou Hellenine?
I have no idea. No. There's a guy, Russell something over here. He's at the Jack the Ripper Museum as well. He was involved in identification through the DNA, and he's a fellow former therapist as well. So we have that in common too. But there are sort of things that emerge in time that are kind of paraded, put forward as being proof that this is the Ripper. Perhaps one of the most famous ones, again, was back in the 1980s when the supposed diary of Jack the Ripper turned up. Do you know about that one?
I've heard
Diary
of
of Jack the Ripper?
Yeah.
Well, the diary itself is supposed to have been written by a guy called James Maybrick, who was actually convicted of murdering his wife in Liverpool. But it was claimed that he would travel on business down to London and carried out a series of murders while he was in London, and then would go back to Liverpool. And this supposed diary of James Maybrick was proof positive that this was Jack the Ripper, because of the things that were written in it were written in such a way as to suggest that it was knowledge that no one would have had at the time other than the Ripper. But again, when you start to look at it in more detail, there was nothing in the diaries that wasn't in the public's mind or knowledge at the time, so there was nothing new in that. It was written in the back of an old Victorian photograph album, so the book was of the right age. The ink that was used to write in it was of the right constituency and make of ink that would have been used in that time through testing to identify these things. So initially it was put forward as being, this could be a genuine document, as being really written by Jack the Ripper. But the problem came when they checked the period of time that the ink had been on the paper. Now, the paper was the right age. It was a Victorian photograph book. The ink was the right constituency for Victorian age ink, but it had been on the paper for less than 10 years. So, fake. The guy who claimed to have found it was a builder who, in fact, said he found it in a skip when they were clearing out a house for demolition. It was later he admitted, no, he wrote it himself. He was a bit of a Ripper fan, and he came up with the idea, and he wrote the thing. But because the first round of tests didn't test the age of ink on the paper, it was worldwide sensation. It was even a TV program was made, and the program is actually really good. It was narrated by a guy called Tom Baker, who was best known for Doctor Who in the 1970s and 80s, was probably the most famous Doctor Who. And he's got a very good voice, and he narrates this program, and it's really quite creepy. It's complete rubbish, but it's really creepy and very well done. But because the tests were not done till later, there was worldwide sensation. This is the James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper. Here's his diary, blah, 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 blah. But as I say, the later testing showed it couldn't possibly be his. But again, there's still, even now, people out there will tell you, no, James Maybrick, he wrote that diary, he was the Ripper. And it's like, well, have you actually read all the evidence? Well, that might be wrong, but it's pretty precise, pretty clear. He admitted himself to have written it. Who supposedly found it. So, and as I say, the Stephen Knight story about the royal conspiracy with a guy called Joseph Sickett, claimed to be the grandson of the Duke of Clarence, and that the Duke of Clarence supposedly married this woman who was then put in an asylum, and that these 5 prostitutes knew the secret, and that they were murdered one by one by fellow Freemasons of Dr. William Gull. Except the Freemasons that he chose in the first version of his story, 2 of them weren't even Freemasons, and 1 of them was not in the area at the time. So Joseph Sickett changes his story again for Stephen Knight. Stephen Knight publishes it, goes around the world, and then Joseph Sickett admits his real name is Joseph Gorman, and you can trace his family record. He's not married to anybody or wasn't descended from anybody in royalty. It's just a whopping big fib, which he got paid a lot of money for. And he admits it was a complete fib until Stephen Knight dies and says, no, it's a true story, really, and I want royalties from Stephen Knight because he agreed to pay me royalties. As I say, it's sold in the millions, this book. And there are still people now who tell you there was a Masonic conspiracy behind Jack the Ripper. It's like, the evidence is, my guy made the story up, was withdrawn it, but you still want to believe it. I say the Duke of Clarence himself, the Prince of Wales, was accused of being Jack the Ripper at one point, except as I say, I think it's the night of the double murder. I'd have to double check to make sure. But certainly on one of the nights of the murders, he was in Scotland with, I think it's the Norwegian royal family, dining in front of hundreds of people, not just fellow attendees of the banquet, but staff were all there. And it was in Scotland. And yet people still say that the Prince of Wales is Jack the Ripper. It's a bit like there's the case in America, I forget the guy's name, is Ted somebody, he's a former senator. No, Ted, I remember his name. He's often been identified recently as having been the guy I mentioned earlier, the Zodiac Killer. People are saying, there's a passing resemblance to him and the Zodiac Killer. I can't remember his name. It's going to bug me now. But he was a former senator. Let me just look it up. Because the interesting thing was, That's it. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
he's much too young. He's much too young.
Yeah.
He's much too young.
He was 4 years old, wasn't he? When the Zodiac Killer was killing. Yet there's still people who tell you that Ted Cruz is the Zodiac Killer. It's insane. You know, people will want to believe stuff. It's really quite frightening.
That's the thing. They don't pay attention to any of the dates or any of that kind of stuff. Because my students are exactly the same way. As soon as that came out, my kids were at school. They were all like, "Oh my gosh, he's the one. He's the one." And I'm like, "Do you realize how old he would have had to have been?" "Oh, it doesn't matter. He was it." I'm like, "No, it really does matter."
Exactly. Yeah, it's like there's minor details like being 4 years old. Yeah, okay. That's the thing, as I say. Unfortunately, people sometimes don't like facts to spoil their theories. I mean, it's something that we know in the psychology profession, the cognitive dissonance, where you have a belief about something, and the more the facts disprove your belief, the more you cling to the belief. It's quite bizarre that we do it, but it's a psychological factor that we have to bear in mind, that people have belief systems, which we have all that belief system. We're on the board of the paranormal. We're all a bit wacky in that respect, but I think most of us are sensible enough to recognise if a theory we've got starts to sort of fall to pieces, we would let go. But a lot of people don't. They'd rather hold on to it and almost say there's a conspiracy against them, that this is a conspiracy against the truth, that these people bring out these actual quotation mark facts that they can't be true. Ted Cruz is really a lot older than he claims to be. There's a secret birth certificate proving he's actually 50 years older than he actually is. That kind of thing can happen. It's like, oh my God. But it happens, unfortunately, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, apparently too often.
Yeah, as I say, it's that thing where you believe something, and when the evidence to the contrary starts to mount up, you tend to cling to the belief. I mean, unfortunately, most religions are a bit like that, really. Religions will reinterpret themselves to take on the new information, new facts, without being able to deal with the information that has been presented. I mean, Christianity should really have fallen apart when they started realising the Earth was not the centre of the universe. It should really have fallen apart at that point, because that's one of the fundamental tenets, that we are the centre of the universe. We're clearly not, but religion carries on. So there we go. But the other thing I'd just like to briefly mention, if it's okay with you guys, is I've got another conference at the end of September, on the 29th of September in the UK here. It's a conference I'm co-organising called The Nameless Art, where we have a number of different speakers talking about various esoteric occult subjects. It's in Southend in Essex, and tickets are still available. You can get tickets via thenamelessart.uk, which is nameless art as one word with E on the end of art.uk. I say I'm the co-host of the thing, so I'm trying to push it a little bit. I'm talking about Dr. John Dee and Enochian magic from the Elizabethan times. As I mentioned earlier, I'm working on my fourth book at the moment. My first book was on Enochian magic and Dr. John Dee. So I'm sort of revisiting that territory 2 weeks after the Seattle conference. So I've got quite a bit of a heavy workload on at the moment. It's all come at once, which is rather annoying, but looking forward to getting that one done too.
Excellent. Can you give us a little preview of what you are gonna like?
Yeah, sure.
Details.
One of the things that's often fascinated me with the areas of the occult is a guy called Dr. John Dee. Have you heard of him?
No.
He was Elizabethan times, so we're talking about the 1500s. He was basically a close friend of Queen Elizabeth I. He was a scientist, mathematician, astronomer, and astrologer. He was basically knew everything about anything. Quite literally, one of the most sort of learned people of his time. He knew all that you could really learn in Elizabethan times about how the world worked. We wanted to know more. He was trying to learn more about the universe, how it worked. And in those times, the 1500s, we're talking about, he thought the best person to talk to would be God and the angels, to get information from them directly. To cut a long story short, he became involved in what's called crystal scrying, which he had a guy called Edward Kelly who'd look into a crystal ball, and Kelly would describe what he was seeing as a clairvoyant. Initially, he was seeing images of traditional angels that were communicating with him. And then he started to see other beings with unusual names that we hadn't come across before. And they began to dictate to him what has become known as the Enochian calls, or kind of rituals, I suppose you could say, or invocations to communicate with angelic beings or communicate with other realms. And they became a whole series of a couple of years, about 3 or 4 years of these communications building up. He was dictated to him various books of magic that came out from these communications. A thing called the Liber Legoath, which is this bizarre book of 48 by 48 squares with letters in each square. And then from that, they found a book called the Enochian Calls. Basically, you'd give a reference number of a number of a grid, and then position like line 4, row 17, letter, whatever that letter is, write that letter down, and then give another grid reference and write that letter down. And one letter at a time would build up these sentences that became known as the Enochian chords. But what was really interesting was the chords are dictated like this, but backwards, one letter at a time. But when you write them down and read them forwards, they were coherent sentences, which have been drawn out from these massive grids of letters. And that was really quite bizarre. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. And in John Dee's writings, it describes how to reenact the calls yourself, how you can communicate with these angelic beings or whatever they are. Now, I'm not a believer in angels in the terms of these guys with wings and feathers and all that kind of business. They're non-human entities. They're non-human intelligences that I think exist in the deep unconscious. So I'm a psychotherapist. My background is more in Carl Jung with things like the archetypes and the collective unconscious. And I think these things, a lot of these paranormal stuff comes from the collective unconscious. And this way of communication was with communication with the collective unconscious, if you like. These beings kind of existed within that realm, and that's who he was communicating with. And you were given a system of communication called the Enochian calls, whereby you, as an individual, could actually have a go at communicating with these things directly, which I've tried and done, and had very strange visions and sort of mental images appearing in my mind. Nothing sort of physically appears around me, but it's almost like astral projection, if you like, these other realms that you get this kind of sense of being in these other dimensions and other places. And what I found was fascinating, when I tried to experiment with this stuff back in the late 1990s, there was no internet and that kind of stuff. I made notes of what I was experiencing, just thinking it was sort of dreams and visions. I started to read other people's work as the internet began to sort of thrive, if you like, in the early 2000s, who carried out these kind of experiments. And they were describing pretty much the same kind of thing I was seeing. It was like we are visiting some kind of shared reality. It was very, very strange, and it was absolutely fascinating. So basically that's what I'm talking about at the conference. The conference itself is about origins of magic, the origins of particular systems of magic, and mine is the origins of Enochian with Dr. John Dee.
And I imagine that's magic with a K.
Say again?
Magic with a K?
Yes.
Yes.
We tend to use that as a differential between that and sort of conjuring magic, don't we, rather than sort of sleight of hand stuff, to define the difference between the two. But yes, it's fascinating stuff. That was my first book. It was my personal experiences of working with the system. I describe the system and then how you can work with it yourself.
Ultimately, what I'm trying to ask you, is it kind of similar to a Ouija board?
I suppose in a sense, except the idea was that he was dictated to him how to create the Enochian calls. The calls themselves, once you have them, which he was given, you then recite them, and you can either stare into a crystal ball as you recite them or just close your eyes and recite them. And the idea is it's like it opens up a part of your subconscious or the collective unconscious, and you go into that realm. So the idea is you mentally go into it rather than it coming to you. Invocation rather than evocation, where invocation you're going into, evocation you bring to you. So the idea is you go to their realm. There are others that use the system to evocate, to bring things to them, but I prefer to go to their place, if you like. I go there rather than they come to me. So that's slightly different sense. I think the idea that it's not a communication between the realms. Your if you like, your spirit essence or whatever, I don't even like that term, but that sort of non-physical you goes to that realm and you explore and you meet people, you meet things, you talk to them, communicate with them, and they say things back to you. And as I say, you could say it was just imagination and nonsense, except as I say, I found people doing the same kind of thing using the calls, were experiencing similar realms. The descriptions of what they were seeing and hearing was similar, not the same, I mean, not identical, but it was similar. It was like, what were the chances, of coming up with something that's similar to what I'm seeing? I mean, it could be coincidence. It could be, of course, but it was just the way the places are described. You're seeing realms and sort of regions of the world that don't look like our world, if you like. I mean, just briefly, one that really stuck in my mind that was really quite powerful was this image. I was standing on one side of basically a huge abyss. It was in front of me. I was on the edge of a forest behind me, and there was like a gap of maybe 20, 30 feet between the grass edge and then fall down the abyss. And across was a huge white city. It was like marble. It was like a very old-fashioned kind of like a castle, but massive, but just in white marble. Sitting across from me on a huge throne was this figure, and it was so bright that you couldn't look at his face. It was just like light coming out from the face. He was sitting there, and it was like you have to cross this abyss to move further forward. And again, as I said, that's how I saw it, and other people have kind of gone to this particular realm and described a similar kind of thing. This mythical white city has been seen by other people as well, describing similarly, having not read anybody else's description. It was like, well, that's just weird. That's just too much. We've seen the same places and having no connection. And again, cultural differences, backgrounds difference. I'm here, these guys are in America. Okay, we have similar language, same language, obviously, but there's cultural differences between Britain and America, no doubt about it. But yeah, we were seeing and experiencing the same kind of thing. It's a little bit like what Carl Jung says about fantasies and fairy tales, how you find similar kind of imagery and stories of fairy tales around the world in cultures that have no connection with each other, no communication between each other, yet have similar descriptions, similar ideals. And he talks about this collective unconscious idea, and I think that's what this is a means and methods going into that deep unconscious and exploring what connections there are, and that almost as if these realms kind of exist at that shared level, much deeper than any individual consciousness or individual mind.
If someone wanted to experience this, is there a recommendation that you could give for like a book?
Yes, mine.
What is it?
My book is called Liber Coronzom. Now it's important because the name Coronzom is one of the few names that are given of the Enochian entities that exist in these other realms. Coronzom is spelled Corozom.
CRRO.
Let me just write it down myself.
Z.
Zom. Yeah.
Z is Z.
C-R.
I know.
Corozom.
And is it Nancy or M as in Mary?
M as in Mary. Yeah, that's one of the biggest things, because often until fairly recently it was ended with the letter N for nanny, when in actual fact, if you go back to John Dee's own original handwritten diary, and this is a whole other show, by the way, we could do this. You go back to John Dee's original handwritten diary entries from the 1500s, you can see the spelling is quite different to how it's been generally published as being. It's often spelled with an N for nanny at the end, where it's actually M for mother. So that's one of the things that my own research uncovered. I mean, a few people found it as well, but mine was one of the first books that actually mentioned the spelling was wrong, that people have been using for centuries. It was actually wrong. But Liber Coronzom from Ain Sophia Press is my first book, and that one is my own personal experience. I give a basic outline of how to use a system yourself, and then I describe my own experiences. So it's there for people to have a try, have a go at themselves.
Well, I've been meditating for the past few months, and I'm wanting to get into transcendental meditation, and that's all about the universal consciousness and getting in alignment with that. And I also, you use the phrase non-human entity, and not a lot of people use that, and that struck home with me. So I'm definitely reading this book, and I'm definitely going to give it a whirl.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully I will have some copies. Actually, probably won't have in time, unfortunately. I might send you a copy if you're free. If it's your birthday. Actually, it's your birthday, yeah, isn't it? I'll dig out a copy if I can. I've got a couple spare. Now, I'm trying to hold on to them because hopefully my publisher gets a new edition to me in time for my conference at the end of the month. But I've got a couple here. I might have to bring a copy for you for your birthday.
I was going to say it is my birthday.
Yes, I know. So perhaps I might have to. I'll bring you.
Nice and slow and soft.
Excuse me. I'll bring you a copy for your birthday, I think.
Oh, Andy, you are so fantastic. This has been a thrilling conversation, and we definitely have to get you back on to talk about this book after I get it, for sure.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate you so much for taking the time, and with the time difference, but between Marianne and I and you, it's awfully late your time, and I can't thank you enough, and I look forward so much to having coffee with you on my birthday.
Yeah, definitely. I do stay out quite late anyway, because I do tend to a fair bit of America anyway, so I usually get to bed before 3. It's 1 a.m. here, guys, if those out there are interested. I usually get to bed to about 3 a.m., so it's perfectly fine for me. I don't start work till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So.
Perfect. Yeah, I was hoping I wasn't keeping you up too late. And Marianne, you're going to be a guest on a radio show. I think you're right after we're done doing this recording. You're going on to another show. Is that correct?
Right.
Are you able to promote that?
Actually, it's a YouTube version, so it'll be sometime. I don't know if he will post it right away or if he's going to post it later. It's going to be on Creator Studio.
Ooh, what are you talking about?
YouTube. For my husband and I, we do visits to haunted locations. So we're going to be interviewed about that and making videos, pretty much.
Excellent.
Their haunted travels is what it's called.
Our haunted travels, yes.
But in my mind, it's their haunted travels because they
right.
are the ones that do it.
Fair enough. I haven't been on a good ghost hunt for a couple of years now, actually. It's been ages since I've been on one. Just never get the time.
Maybe we should just organize one while you're here.
Oh my God. The bore the life of my wife.
I know you're going to be busy. I know. And there's actually not very many haunted things down here.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll find something needed. But the same, my wife, she gets bored for another show, but she recorded what is probably the best piece of video footage I've ever seen, and she recorded it. All my years of media investigating, my wife recorded it, but it is pretty good. So we'll talk about that another time, perhaps.
Yep, we're having you on again for sure, without a doubt.
Yeah,
everybody, that was Andy Mercer, station manager of Paranormal UK Radio Network, joining us tonight. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will catch you for the next episode. And until then, stay scared.
Oh, just some scary movie. You know, the one with the guy in the white mask who walks around and stalks babysitters.